Thank you for being here. This was obviously kind of a difficult morning to everybody get up. Some of us have power and some of us don't. So thank you for being here. We are missing some folks, and hopefully they'll trickle in during the course of the day. But the important thing is that we're here this morning, and thanks for coming. I see a lot of familiar faces, so I know some of you have been to previous conferences, and so that's great. Had the opportunity this morning to talk to Barbie back there on the back row about some of the things we've done with these conferences and the offshoots in forms of other presentations, concepts, books, chapters, things like that. And that's what this is all about. The inception of this conference idea was from our deans at UNCG and Wake Forest reading a Kaufman report about entrepreneurship and the fact that librarians can and are innovative and entrepreneurial thinking people, especially in this day and age with economic uncertainties and things like that. And so we're learning how to advocate in a different way. We're learning how to address our constituents, our communities, our academic institutions. We're learning how to let them know that we are valuable and viable to the institution's mission. So spread whatever you learned today, please spread it around. That's part of the point. Part of my remarks, I was going to talk about an entrepreneur. So I'm going to nerd out on you a little bit. And there's a new book out by William Shatner. Okay? And y'all know William Shatner was Captain Kirk. And some of you are saying, wait a minute, I thought it was Chris Pine. No. Captain Kirk was William Shatner. We'll always remember that. And he's in his late 80s now, I think, but he's had an extremely interesting career. And he's on horses and wineries and land and all this kind of stuff. So he has been, since he was Captain Kirk, he has been very entrepreneurial. And that's what the book is about. The book is titled Live Long and ... kind of deal. Okay, so he's living long and entrepreneurially. But in the book, it talks about taking risks. And to me, that's one of the most important things about being entrepreneurial or being innovative, taking a risk. Taking a risk if you're thinking of something, doing something, or driving something that isn't within the common realm of things that people don't readily connect to. So you have to also put together the pieces that make them understand why it's important or how it can be efficient or helpful. So there's a whole method there, and that's what we've been kind of celebrating with these conferences. So take the risk, that's what William Shatner says, and live long and prosper, entrepreneur, be innovative, however you want to put it. So once again, thanks for being here. I want to point out a couple things here in the program. First of all, the hardworking committee that's on the second page. I think most of you know them, okay, and they've done a great job of getting this pulled together again. This is our first venue off campus, and so we think that's innovative in itself. It's being something a little bit different. The lovely Mary Beth is going to come forward and talk to you about the building a little bit. Also want to invite you on the last page to look at the website, to look at some of the articles and offshoots I was talking about in terms of publications and activities and things like that. And on the website, we have an active website with all the current stuff on there. And if you're interested in publishing, if you're representative, if you're interested in publishing your work, we'll do that through an open access method. And it'll be posted on the website or kind of the end of So I'm going to turn it over to Mary Beth, and she's going to talk more about life here in Mississippi.
Hello. Does everybody hear me? So I think that one of the true strengths of an entrepreneur is showing persistence. So good on you all. Excellent work. I think that between the hurricane yesterday and the parking this morning, that probably the hardest part of the entrepreneurship conference is over. And from here on out, it's just going to be interesting stuff. We lost one pair of presenters because they were trying to get here from Texas and got stranded in LaGuardia, and so they are not going to be here. So there will be one of our sessions that, I think it's the 11:20 session that's in 4903. Oh, let me orient you to the building. So we have 4 breakout spaces. 3 of them are on the first floor where you checked in that corner. It's kind of an L-shaped building, and so where you walked in was here at the entrance, and then walked down that hall, taking the elevator up, walking down the hall this way. So it's in. And 2 of the spaces that will be here, the keynote is this morning here, and also the lunchtime keynote is here in this room. There's 1 room that's down the hall over here that's 4903, and that is the largest of the classrooms. And those are the places that room is where all of the briefer sessions are being held. So if there are 2 sessions that are happening at one time, that's going to be in those rooms. And the remainder of them are down in the first floor in that corner. So as you're walking back towards in that direction, you'll see all 3 of them are right there. So that's your orientation. We thank you for being here today. It's awesome to see you all. There's a whole lot of name tags that haven't been picked up yet, so I think others might be struggling a little bit to get here, but we're going to go ahead and get started with our first keynote. But throughout the day, anybody that's on the committee, can you just raise your hand so that if anybody has questions that you can feel free to reach out to us. We'll be happy to sort of help you out with things. Also to know that the restrooms are all stacked, and they are heading back in this direction just past the elevator, and that there's a little inlet there, and that's where the restrooms are, so feel free to use them. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Brian Hart, who is going to introduce the opening keynoter, and Patrick Sweeney, who is readily awaiting us to begin. So thank you for being here.
All right, welcome. My name is Brian Hart. I'm Deputy Director for the Greenville Public Library, and happy to have been able to participate on the Conference Planning Committee this year. I have the pleasure of introducing my friend and colleague with EveryLibrary, Patrick PC Sweeney. He is the co-author of Winning Elections and Influencing Politicians for Library Funding. He is the former Administrative Librarian of the Sunnyvale Public Library and Executive Director of EveryLibrary California, which is a statewide initiative to support library propositions. He currently works as the political director for EveryLibrary, which is the nation's first and only political action committee. Show of hands if you're familiar with EveryLibrary. Okay, very nice. And so following this conversation, the whole room will have their hands raised, obviously. And Patrick is also a 2015 Library Journal Mover and Shaker and recipient for his advocacy work, in California and across the country. So Patrick is a really good friend of mine, and I think it's very fitting that he is our keynote speaker, or one of our keynote speakers for this conference, as he and John Kraska really took a risk in developing and forging ahead with the formation of EveryLibrary. And I think entrepreneurship is all about risk. And so without further ado, I will introduce and I present to you via New York, Patrick Sweeney.
Thanks, Brian. I appreciate it. Can everybody hear me all right?
Yeah.
Great. So thanks, Brian, for introducing me. And this is of course a little bit different than I had expected, because I expected to be there. So I apologize for not making it. My flight kept getting pushed back until finally it didn't leave until 7 a.m. this morning, which wouldn't have gotten me there anywhere near in time. So I appreciate everybody's flexibility in having me, and I really appreciate this opportunity to speak to all of you. And of course, thank you, Brian, for putting me in contact here. So my name is Patrick Sweeney. I am the political director for EveryLibrary. You can find me online as PC Sweeney. If you have questions, if you want to tweet anything that I say, if you want to argue with me on Twitter, you can find me on Twitter as PC Sweeney, but you can also find me Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, everywhere as PC Sweeney. So if you have any questions or anything that you'd like to follow up on, or any other ideas, you can find me that way. I am Patrick Sweeney in person, but I use PC Sweeney because there are a million Patrick Sweeneys on the internet, and there's only 2 PC Sweeneys. It's me and the police dog in the UK. So I'm the one that's not the police dog, obviously. So let's talk about what we're going to do here. So this is a presentation on big data, advocacy, and ROI. EveryLibrary is for all intents and purposes, a nonprofit startup. We have come a long way in the last 6 years that we've been around. We are really proud of a lot of the work that we've been able to do in the last 6 years. Primarily, we have helped libraries at the ballot box. We do this work pro bono. We are paid for by Gale, Mango, Demco, Brainfuse, all those major companies and organizations that want to ensure that libraries have more money. And the reason that we're able to provide these services pro bono is obviously because they pay us, also because libraries can't really afford to hire campaign professionals to run their campaigns and elections. And we provide a wide range of support to libraries at the ballot box. And through the work that we've done in the last 6 years, we've been able to help libraries earn about $1.6 billion in stable library funding, which is really exciting. We've worked with about 85 campaigns across the country. Plus, we do a lot of work with school libraries and other various political actions and activities. Everything that happens at the intersection of library funding and politics, that's what we are really interested in. So we have, we are a little bit different in the library ecosystem. We are doing something that's new. There are very few 501c4s. There's only 3 that I know about, and those are library associations, and they work at the state level. As a 501c4, we are a little bit different in that we are allowed to expend 100% of our resources on political activities for libraries. We're not in competition with any state associations or the ALA or any other major association because legally we have a different structure and we're able to do a different set of work. So as a 501c3, for example, like the American Library Association is lobbying at Washington office. Organizations like Urban Librarian here in New York does very good work advocating for the borough libraries here, and but we work on political activity at the local level, primarily initiatives, campaigns, and elections. And the reason that we do this work, and the reason that we built this as a political agency, is because 98% of library funding is politically motivated in this country. And what that means is that about 90% of library funding, the biggest chunk of our library funding, comes from the will of the local voters and the will of the local politicians. So voters vote for referendums, bond initiatives, other campaigns, other elections, renewals, those kinds of things in order to ensure that libraries have funding locally. That's 90% of the library funding model. Another 3 to 5% comes from the state. Another 3 to 5% comes from the federal level. We are primarily interested in working in that 90% area. So the reason that we're learning from politics is because our funding is political. And that is really, really important, because if we don't start to understand this political ecosystem where our paychecks come from, we're no longer going to get those paychecks. And we're seeing a lot of attacks on the kinds of things that fund libraries and ensure that libraries continue to exist. And those attacks are entirely political in nature. And we need to really start to understand that. The other reason that we're learning from politics is because politics is really, really successful. Political agencies, political models of advocacy, political causes, Fight for 15, Standing Rock, Occupy Wall Street, even big organizations, Sierra Club, ACLU, even organizations like the NRA. I think we see how successful they are in moving the political needle one way or another. And if we're not able to do that, if we're not able to understand that, then libraries are really significantly at risk. The political initiatives also are very good at fundraising. They're also very good at thinking very entrepreneurially about the way that they do their work, so they're able to bring resources back to their campaigns to continue them. And what that means is that we need to get over that there's this weird idea in library advocacy that it's bad to be profitable as an advocacy organization, that we have to give stuff away, that we have to be completely self-sacrificing if we want our advocacy to be successful. And that just isn't true. And if we look at the political models, if we see what they're doing in politics, we start to see that political advocacy is highly, highly profitable. Not to the level, like, it's not as profitable as I would like it to be personally, but we see the tools and tactics that they're using, they return resources to their causes. And they do that because that's the only way to make their advocacy sustainable. If we don't start taking this entrepreneurial spirit that political organizations have and start understanding that entrepreneurship, the startup culture, the understanding the mechanisms that return and tactics and strategies and tools that return resources to an advocacy campaign, then we're never going to have sustainable level advocacy. And so the way EveryLibrary works, and the way that we are able to sustain our work isn't just from the donations from those big vendors who pay for us, but also from individual donors, small donors, and a few larger donors. But the reason that we're able to be sustainable is because every activity we take, we are very cautious about ensuring that it returns more resources to the organization than we expend, so that we're able to take larger actions next year. If we're able to raise 25% more this year, then we will be able to expend 25% more next year, right? And so this is sort of this snowball effect, this growing effect that we have in every decision-making, in our entire decision-making process in our advocacy work. So in order to understand how we do that, I'm going to give away some of our secrets on how we make our advocacy profitable, how we make it sustainable. Now, the first thing is that we always start with the data. Every political action, every political activity that you have, if you're talking about a sophisticated organization, they start building the data first. And they start understanding that political ecosystem that they work within so that they can start manipulating it, so they can start working with it, so they can understand the things that people care about, the things that people want, what motivates them to give, what motivates them to volunteer, what motivates them to sign petitions or take actions. And that all starts with understanding the underlying data. So in our data, we have a few sources. The first one is like the Pew the Pew Library Research, which is really, really interesting. This comes from 2016. I think everybody's pretty familiar with this first one. Millennials use libraries at a higher rate than any other demographic. I don't think that comes as a surprise to any of us who work in libraries. And then parents are more likely to use libraries than adults without children. Again, I don't think that's surprising either. And I don't think it's very surprising that the majority of Americans hold very positive views about libraries. Now, these are all really great metrics to have, but they're not political in nature. They're people's sort of propensity for having some kind of faith in libraries, some kind of belief in libraries, but it's not quite enough. If we're talking about a political campaign, if somebody isn't a voter, but they have positive views about the library, or if they have negative views about the library, as a political organization and talking about the way that I expend my resources, I don't care. And that was one of the hardest things for me to come to terms with working on political campaigns. If somebody's not a voter, they have no power and no control over the work that libraries are doing, over the funding that libraries have. And so we kind of start ignoring them, and that's how we kind of conserve some of our resources, and that we can segment an audience of just voters, and we can speak to just voters instead of speaking to everybody in the community. And that's a really difficult decision to make. I'll talk more about that a little bit later as well. So let's start getting into the actual data that matters. Then in 2018, voters view the library as an essential local institution, as advancing education, as a source of community pride, as enhancing the quality of life. And so, I'm sorry, I'm getting my voice back in my head. Hold on one second. Okay. So, All right. So, I don't think these are really things that we're unfamiliar with. I think we see this every day in our work, and these are very telling for us because we can start to play on these things when we're talking about mess. Now we have people in education, that's the highest one, and we can advance education in order to move their support to a greater level. And I'll talk about that when we talked about the messaging as well. Now, in 2008, so this study, awareness to funding, was done twice in this country. It was done in 2008 and it was done in 2018. What terrifies me is that if libraries are fundamentally funded by local voters at a 90% rate, look at voters' propensity for voting for libraries twice in our entire industrial history, then we have a significant problem. If we were a political initiative or a political cause, we would be measuring this year after year after year. We'd be running focus groups, we'd be running data, all kinds of stuff, but we've only done it twice. And so this is all the data that we have, essentially. So in 2008, 37% of Americans would definitely vote yes for the library. And what that means is that it didn't matter what you put in front of them. If it was a measure for $5 or it was a measure for $5 million or $50 million or $500 million, they would see the word library and they would just vote yes because they believe in the power and importance and significance of libraries. Then we have 26% of Americans who are just terrible, terrible human beings. And it doesn't matter what you say or do, they are going to vote no against libraries. Libraries could cure cancer, no puppy could ever get sick. No matter what happens, they're never going to vote yes to support libraries because they have a belief primarily about taxes, primarily about government. And that's really where we see this no vote coming from. Now we have this middle 37% who are likely to vote yes if we just convince them, if we talk to them in an open and transparent way, if we answer their honest questions, if we engage with them in a way that they would like to be engaged, they're very likely to move up into that definitely vote yes area. But again, only if we communicate with them. Now, if we're running a political campaign and we look at these demographics, this is the same thing as any kind of market segmentation. Marketing Pepsi to people who drink, something else isn't going to increase your market share. You want to talk to people who have a likelihood of enjoying your product, right? And of course, if we're doing any other kind of product, we're not necessarily talking to the people who are already buying it. We're not going to talk to the people who are never going to buy it. We're going to talk to the people who are most likely to purchase it. And we use the same kind of philosophy when we're talking about politics. So in a political campaign, we would do a process called voter ID, where we call everybody on the voter file. We ask, will you vote yes? Will you vote no? Do you need more information? And if they say yes, we put them in a nice, neat pile on our desk. If they say no, we put them in a nice, neat pile in the trash can. And then if we have that middle 37%, we target them throughout the campaign to convince them to move to yes. And the reason that is because it costs 20 to 1 to move somebody from a definitely vote no to a yes. And so if I can identify 20 yes voters, or I can convince one, which one is best for the organization? How do I make that decision? I think it's very easy. You go get the 20 and you forget about the one. And so that's how political campaigns kind of work. Now, this is 2008 data, of course. Now, watch what happens in 2018. We lost 10% of the definitely vote yes for the library community. We lost 10% of Americans who would vote yes for our institutions. We lost 6% of the people who are likely to vote yes for our institutions. What that means is now we have 42% of Americans are likely or will definitely vote no against libraries. And that is really important to understand, because once we start hitting that 50% threshold, then we are going to start seeing libraries get decimated. And as this inches up, as this continues to move up, we really need to be watching it. The second this hits 50% across the country, we are really going to start seeing libraries lose voter support, which means they're going to lose funding, which means they're going to close. which means we don't have a job, okay? And this is the big thing that scares me. We could feel this happening as we've been running the campaigns for the last 6 years. This data validates what we were seeing out in the field, but we really need to understand this. The other thing we need to understand is that the positive image of the library has increased, but the willingness to vote for it has decreased. So if we look at, and this again comes from that awareness to funding study, and from 2018, we have the people who are super supporters. These are people who don't just like definitely vote yes. These are people from the definitely vote yes who also would do anything to make sure that libraries continue to exist. These are like super supporters. And we lost 1% of super supporters, or 6.6%, which is just within well within the margin of error. So it's negligible. But the thing that's interesting is that they went from 71% who rate libraries positively up to 80%. So they like libraries even more than they did before, but they're less likely to vote for it. The percent of that segment that would vote yes for the libraries went from 80 to 64%. So they are 16% less likely to vote yes for libraries, even though they rate libraries as positively or more positively than they did before, and they rate librarians more positively than they did before. That is really interesting. The other thing is from the probable supporters, we lost 7% of probable supporters. They went down 11% in how many of them would probably vote yes for libraries. So you know that population is significantly shrinking, but they still rate libraries as positively as they did before. And so what this really means to me, and what I think is that this data really pulls out, is that our advocacy is working in this industry if our measurement of advocacy success is whether or not somebody likes a library. But our advocacy is fundamentally failing if our measurement of that success is whether or not they will vote yes for libraries. These are things like we need to start really thinking about the way we do advocacy, because so much of the advocacy that we do is all about whether or not somebody likes libraries and not whether or not somebody will vote for libraries. And those are very, very different conversations that we need to start having. I'm going to talk about that more in just a minute. Some more of the voter attitudes that I think are really interesting, that I think librarians really need to understand, is that political party doesn't matter. And what that means is that it doesn't matter if somebody's a conservative, it doesn't matter if somebody's a progressive, they're just as likely to vote yes to support libraries. And I think that's very surprising for a lot of people. But we see very, very progressive individuals voting against libraries. We see very conservative people voting for libraries. We see libraries really well funded in very red areas. And we see libraries very poorly funded in some progressive areas. We just kind of see this over and over and over again across the country. We have an issue in librarianship where, issue is not the right word, but we have this ecosystem that we have in our industry, especially amongst our employees. We look at the voter file from across the country, and we can see that in an enhanced voter file, I know what the voter does for a living. Enhanced voter files can be very enhanced and very scary, but I can see what people are employed as, or what issues they care about, all kinds of different things. So when I look at a national voter file and I can pull out all the librarians, and I can look at that data set about all the librarians, 78% of librarians are registered on the progressive side of politics. I don't think this surprises anybody either, but what it does is it creates a sort of bias against conservatives as the other. However, if we understand that conservatives are just as likely to vote for libraries as progressives, that changes the way we have to start thinking, especially if we're working in red states, especially if we're working in Trump country, because people will support libraries. My dad, who I'm scared to ask who he voted for in the last election, he is very anti-tax, very anti-government, but he will always vote for libraries because he believes in the fundamental good of reading, of children gaining access to things that help them pull themselves up by their bootstraps and get themselves out back to work. Don and I did a conference or training series in Washington, and we went to this very, very rural town called Colfax, and we sat in this cafe in the morning, and these old timers in the corner saw us walk in with our suits, which is our fault for walking into one of these rural areas in suits. They came over with their John Deere hats and started hassling us, saying, "You boys aren't from around here. You must be government workers. This is Republican country, whatever." But when we started talking to them about the fact that we were working for libraries, they were quickly on our side. They think libraries are valuable. They love the library director. They love the things that the library was doing for the community. But they came over to hassle us specifically because they thought we were progressives. They were right. But, they came over to hassle us for that political position. But when they found out that we were working for libraries, they were on our side. So that was just really interesting and really telling. We see it out in the field over and over and over again. The other thing that's interesting is that card statistics don't matter. We've seen libraries win campaigns in areas where only 30% of the community has a library card. We've seen libraries lose campaigns where 80% of the community has a library card. The number of people who have a card in your community has no bearing on the outcome of a campaign or election. I think that's really important to understand. The other thing is that library use doesn't matter. And what that means is that it doesn't matter if somebody uses the library or not. They're just as likely to vote for or against your library, regardless of how they use it, when they use it, anything like that. Now, we do see a thing in the data whenever we do public opinion polling before a campaign in a community. We do see a slight bump, but only in the demographic of people who use the library more than once every 2 weeks. If somebody uses the library more than once every 2 weeks, they're about 2% more likely to vote yes for the library than somebody who is a non-user. But if they use it any less than once every 2 weeks, then they drop off to the same propensity for voting yes for libraries as somebody who doesn't use the library at all. So we need to understand that as we're doing this kind of work. The one thing that does matter, the one thing that motivates voters the most to vote yes for libraries is people's belief in their relationship with their librarian. And when I use the word librarian throughout this presentation, I'm talking about everybody that is a librarian, which means everybody who is a volunteer, anybody who works on the board, who's on the board of trustees, anybody who is a certified staff, uncertified staff, holds an MLIS, doesn't hold an MLIS, doesn't matter. The public, anybody who works in or around the library is a librarian. And if from a political standpoint, I'm not going to correct that view. I'm not going to expend resources on correcting that view, because if they believe that the person who's shelving the books in my library is a librarian, and they have a great relationship with them, and so they're more likely to vote yes for my library, I'm not going to correct them and say they're not a librarian. We might lose that vote, right? And so understanding how to expend those resources is really important. We need to put librarians out into the community as often as possible. We need to get people speaking to their community. I'm going to talk about relational supporters later on in this presentation. But the reason this works primarily is because it's very, very easy for somebody who's anti-government and anti-tax to vote against the corrupt and bureaucratic town that's sucking up my tax dollars. But it's very hard to vote against, Brian Hart, who I know does a very good job, who I know personally, who helps me out every day, who I see working hard, all those kinds of things. It's very hard to vote against a person. It's very easy to vote against an institution. Yeah. So what does that mean? So bringing all of that together, what this actually means for us is that if our jobs are entirely dependent upon the will of the local voters and the will of the local politicians, and if we don't have that, then we lose our jobs, then that means that whether or not we like it, we are candidates for our jobs. We need to start thinking about our libraries as campaign operations, as political operations, because that's what our jobs are dependent upon. And if we don't start understanding how to run a political cause, how to run a political ideology, how to run a political campaign, we are going to start to lose that funding support like we're seeing that we're losing right now. We're going to continue that trend until we're over 50%, and we're going to start losing libraries. So we have to think like a politician, whether or not we like it. All right. So in thinking about that, we have 3 resources. Political activists, political operatives have 3 resources and only 3 resources that they can use to run a campaign or election. And those 3 resources are time, money, and people. And if we understand that equation, if we understand that we are going to expend time in order to get money and people, and we're going to spend time and money to get people on our side, then you start understanding a lot about the decision-making process and the work that we're doing every single day. Okay? And so, so we need to understand, number 1, what influences politics, and that is money and people. With enough money, you can embarrass them out, right? You can run ads, you can do billboards, you can do all kinds of voter education drives, you can do all kinds of different things. If you have the people on your side, of course, you can vote them out, you can hold rallies, you can hold events, you can do fundraising, like all different kinds of things. The 2 things that influence politics the most are people and money. And people and money are the things that politicians respond to. If you're an organization that doesn't have people and money, then you are an organization that plain and simply doesn't have any political power. A lot of us do legislative days in our states or with the ALA at the federal level, and a lot of times we see politicians being stopped at the staffer, right, the person who manages the politician's office, and you have a meeting with them instead of the politician. And the reason that happens is because there is no consequence for the politician to not meet with us. There's no consequence for them to meet with us. If they meet with us, they don't lose funding. If they don't meet with us, they don't lose political support because we don't have any of that political power to do that kind of work with. And so, for example, like organizations like ALEC, I always forget the name of, but they're a lobbying group that works primarily for the oil industry. They have millions and millions of dollars. They have millions of people in their database. And so a politician is always going to take a meeting with ALEC because if they don't, ALEC can email a million people and tell them how corrupt this politician is. They can if the politician meets with them, ALEC can help fund their campaign. And that is political power. And libraries just don't have that. There's no, even with ALA, even though it's a multi-million-dollar organization, it's not a politically powerful organization. And because if something happens in the library industry, ALA's email list is like 45,000 people. 45,000 people nationally is it's less than 1,000 people in each state. No politician is going to respond to that. And so we need to understand that we need to build people and that we need to build money in order to have political power, in order to ensure that we can meet with politicians in order to help build up our industry. And we're going to start talking about that as well. Because what we can get is probably not money, unfortunately. Like, as much as I jokingly say that EveryLibrary is like the NRA for libraries, we are nowhere near that. We're never going to have that kind of funding. Well, we do have the same legal structure where we can do the same kind of lobbying work. We can do a lot of the same different things. We are never going to have that level of funding. We're never going to have Koch brothers or George Soros level of funding. We're just not, unfortunately. But because, as you guys saw in the data, people overwhelmingly support libraries, we can get people more than anything else, and it's very easy for us to get people. So we need to expend our time and our money in order to get more people on our side, and that comes down to voter education and a lot of other tactics that we're going to be talking about. Now, this comes out of the Awareness to Funding study. This is one of the conclusions of things that libraries should be doing. And I highlight this because this is what we've been talking about for the last 6 years, and I was so impressed to see this in here. But what they said was cultivate and empower super supporters. And I'm going to push back on that a little bit, even though I think what they're saying here is absolutely right. But we need to identify, cultivate, and empower our super supporters, because right now we don't know who our super supporters are in this country. We have no idea what kind of person, what demographic group makes somebody likely to be a library supporter, and we don't have and we don't know specifically which humans in this country are our super supporters. So before we can cultivate and empower them, we have to know who they are. And we'll talk about that data as well in just a minute. But you know, we need to start talking about the segment's loyalty, We need to start talking about how we can engage and leverage this group as library ambassadors to advocate with decision makers and influence other segments of the population that might be more disconnected or skeptical. That is really significant because this right here is exactly how Americans for Prosperity works, how the NRA works, but it's also how the Sierra Club works, how the Human Rights Campaign works, how Fight for 15 works, how the Fight for Legalizing Marijuana works. Every single political initiative works exactly this way, which is identify, cultivate, and empower your super supporters. Now, if we have 6% of the American population are our super supporters, that is, what is that? That is 18 million Americans. And 18 million Americans is a huge, huge population of Americans. The ACLU only has 1.4 million supporters. That's it. And they went from 400,000 to 1.4 million in the last 2 years because of the Trump bump, okay? They only had 400,000 supporters previous to Trump's administration. Now they have 1.4. We need to build up, 3 to 5 million people in order to have the level of power and influence that ACLU does. The NRA only has between 8 and 10 million supporters. And while they're very loud because the NRA has done a very good job cultivating and empowering their super supporters, it doesn't make up a huge segment of the population, but it's enough for them to have political power. It's enough for them that if a politician doesn't meet with them, they can immediately email millions of people in that person's district or hundreds of thousands or even thousands of people within that politician's district to get them to turn against that politician, right? And that's political power. So that is why our strategy is to get supporters. It is get users, and I think that's a really important distinction for us to have because if we are trying to build a political campaign, but in order to do that, we have this idea in librarianship that if they just use us, they will support us, and that's just not true. We don't see that in the data anywhere. And in most of the libraries that I've worked in, I have never needed more users. I would have nowhere to put more users. I would only have somewhere for more support. If somebody came into the library, a lot of libraries that I've worked in, they would have nowhere to sit. I don't need more people to use my library. I need more people to support it so that I can have the funding to build a bigger library, to expand our services, maybe outside of the library itself. I can have that funding so that I can serve the people who want to be served within my community. Support is different than use. The other thing to remember is that on the way to support, moving people to become supporters, the people who have a likelihood for using the library will use it on their way to becoming supporters. And I want to make a distinction between getting supporters and how we get them. Tactics are how we get supporters. Tactics are things like using Facebook, direct mail, email, Facebook, whatever. That is different. A lot of times we walk into a political campaign and they say we've got a great strategy, we're using Facebook. Well, Facebook isn't a strategy. Facebook is a tactic to accomplish the strategy of getting to 33% of my population being a library supporter, right? That is the difference between a strategy and a tactic. So what you need to understand is that somebody is only a supporter if you have their contact information and if they've taken action on your behalf. You can't count somebody as a supporter if they just like libraries. Just liking libraries isn't support. Liking libraries is signing petitions, taking action, standing up for libraries, making donations, volunteering, those kinds of things. Somebody isn't a supporter unless we can get their name, address, phone number, email address, and we can start having those communications with them. In old campaigns, it was on 3x5 cards. A political campaign had hundreds of thousands of 3x5 cards with notes on names, address, phone, whether they're a supporter, whether they weren't a supporter. That's how this works. Today, we use platforms like Nation Builder and NGP Bands, Vote Builder. The Republicans use something called I360, Cambridge Analytica, those kinds of tools. Those are supporter identification tools. And we have this other thing in the library industry where all of our advocacy goes one way. Everything that we do, we're going out to telling people how good libraries are. We put things out into the community. We put things out into the community. We put things out into the community. And we hope that if they hear those good things about us, then they'll just make a decision to support us. And that leaves out a huge segment of work that needs to get done. We think if somebody hears a good story from us, if we show up at a politician's office and we tell them a good story, then they'll just give us funding. But that is, then a miracle occurs somewhere in the middle there, and that process is really missing in the advocacy work that we're doing. We have to figure that out. I'm going to talk about how we figure that out. We are leaving out about 90% of what real political activity, what political advocacy is in this country. A huge, huge piece of work. It's a ton of things. It's not just putting up things like a Libraries Transform poster and saying, okay, now we're advocating for libraries. That's not advocacy. That's just putting up a Libraries Transform poster. Putting up a read poster above a drinking fountain is not advocacy. Geek the Library stuff is not truly advocacy. It's awareness raising. It's making people feel good about libraries, but it's not driving them to action. Okay, and we need to start understanding how we drive people to action. And we do that through this sort of activist model in which every decision that we make, everything that we do brings something back to our campaigns. And this is how we start thinking about our work in terms of ROI, how we do our work in terms of sustainability or profitability, right? If we put something out, we need to get back more than we put out. If we put out a banner, if we put out a Facebook post, if we put out anything, we need to get something back. And this just goes back to the way we do this work. So, for example, with the Libraries Transform poster, if you put up a poster that says, because you can't afford textbooks on a ramen noodle diet, and 100,000 people walk by it, and 1,000 of those people are like, you know what, that's absolutely right, but you don't know who those 1,000 people are, then it wasn't advocacy. You have to figure out a way to build into that system some way to identify those 1,000 people who that resonated with so that you can engage them. And remember, identifying them means you get their name, address, phone number, email, some way to contact them, some way to talk to them, and you get that back, and then you engage them. That is activism. And that's how we can start making decisions based on that return on investment. So this means that if I have $1,000 and I don't get $1,001 back, I'm not, on some tactic, I'm not going to do that tactic. And that's hard to do because there are a lot of things that feel good for us to do. There's things that we want to do that we think are beneficial. However, if we don't get back more than we put into it, then we shouldn't be doing it. This is about streamlining processes. This is about thinking like an entrepreneur. If I'm an entrepreneur, I'm not going to spend a ton of money. If I have a small startup, I'm not going to spend a ton of money on activities that aren't going to sell me more product. I'm not going to spend any money if I'm a smart entrepreneur on something that's not going to sell more of my product out in the community. The same thing works with advocacy and activism. We spend $1,000, we get $1,001 back. That is our goal. If it's a penny back more than we spend, I call it a success, right? And that's how we build that sustainability into our advocacy work. So let's start talking about how exactly we start doing this. First of all, we need to understand there are 4 kinds of supporters: relational, ideological, aversion, and access. And we have relational supporters. These are supporters that are closest to us, that we know. These are our friends, neighbors, whatever. Then we have ideological. These are people who have the same beliefs as us, who don't know us personally, but are groups in the community who have the same value system. Then we have aversion supporters, which we see often. And last year we saw a lot of people vote yes for libraries, more than they did before, but they weren't voting yes for libraries. They were really voting against Trump. Because Trump had that big initiative to shut down libraries, or the proposal to shut down federal funding for libraries. There was this attack on libraries. People were voting against Trump. They weren't voting for libraries. That is an aversion supporter. They're doing something against somebody else. Then there's access supporters. We don't really get access supporters because access supporters are people who make contributions to campaigns or take action for political causes, or to gain access to the cause or to the leaders of the cause. So if I give a big campaign contribution to Obama, it gets me access to Obama. Giving a big campaign contribution to my library gets me access to the library director. People probably don't do that because I mean, what power does the library director have really in the community, right? We don't have enough power for people to give us money just to access us. So let's dive into managing relational supporters. We're going to kind of ignore for this talk. We're going to ignore aversion and access supporters since it doesn't make up a big enough population for us to really get into. Now, relational supporters are friends, family, neighbors, coworkers, colleagues, people that we know. And so if we want to build up relational supporters, we need to start getting out into our community, and we need to understand that we're building these relationships with people in our community. This is networking, schmoozing. This is showing up at city council meetings. This is doing outreach. This is doing tabling. This is finding people who have the same kind of values as us, but then identifying them, becoming friends with them, building up a relationship with them, so that a year or two down the line, when we haven't asked for donations, for volunteers, for a campaign, we already have them on our side. And we have to understand our mutual outcomes, why we're partnering with them. Are we building coalitions with them? Are we going out into the community and building coalitions with the museums, with local ed groups, with after-school homework help, with the schools, those kinds of things, right? And this is the hardest part, I think, in order to build these relationships, especially with people that we don't know, but picking up the phone and dialing and saying, hey, will you go have coffee with me? I want to talk about the amazing things that you're doing for our community, the things that you believe in. This is people who are business leaders, people who are maybe sitting on your city council, who are on the big boards in your community. Calling them up and just sitting down and having coffee with them is the easiest and quickest way to build up a support from your relational supporters within your community. You have to get to know them as people. You have to get out and meet them. So when you show up to drink more coffee with people, sitting down having a meeting is easy. Talk to them about, I like what you're doing. I support what you're doing. I want to identify us with what you're doing. And that is important because that starts to bring them on your side. You're not asking them for anything. You are just there to support them, to help them, to build that kind of relationship in that arena of trust in which you aren't asking for something. Because as soon as you meet somebody and the first thing you do is ask them for something, they're going to be very skeptical about why you're out having coffee with them. They now believe that you are only with them in order to get something out of them. If you want to build up these authentic relationships, you have to build them up years before you need to ask them for something. That's called surfacing in a campaign, by the way. But going out and meeting those people. And there's a lot of partners that you can get out into your community and build these relational supporters from. We have educational partners, we have social welfare and religious partners, we have government partners, we have civic partners, business, politicians, media. We should be getting out and meeting each of these people because the relational people in our communities are the people who are going to build the foundation of anything that we do. They're the first people that you call in a political campaign to volunteer or donate. The first people that will make up your ballot committee, the first people who will make up your campaign or cause committee, they are the ones who do it. And if we're doing a political campaign, one of the first things that you do with a candidate is you sit down with them and you say, all right, I want a spreadsheet of everybody that you know, everybody that you've ever met. Don't just brainstorm. Don't cross anybody off the list. I want a complete list. And go back all the way to their second grade girlfriend or boyfriend. I don't care, but I want a list of everybody. If you're working with a candidate who won't do that, you need to stop working with that candidate. And that's what political operatives do, political consultants do. The first thing they do is say, who do you know? Because those are the people who are going to make up your campaign. I worked with somebody who was running for lieutenant governor in California, and they refused to tell me who they were, who they knew. They refused to make phone calls to the people that they knew to build their base of support. I just walked away from that campaign because there was no way it was going to go anywhere, and it didn't, right? That is the most important piece. Now, so let's start talking about ideological supporters because this is where it gets interesting. This is kind of where a lot of the fun work happens. But ideological supporters have the same social identities, social circles, the same political identifications. They follow kind of the same opinion leaders, and understanding that that these are the things that motivate people, that drive people to make decisions politically, is really important to understand. These are the top 4 areas that motivate people to make decisions on whatever value they have, okay? Class, race, gender, and religion are absolutely the strongest 4 measurements for understanding somebody's propensity for supporting your cause or initiative. Social circles is next. People social circles that they know. You know, your mom always told you to not run around with those bad kids in the community because you'll become a bad kid. That is the same kind of principle here. People's political identification is less influential than their social identities, their social circles. And then opinion leaders is less influential than that. This comes from a great book called Campaigns and Elections that was just published like 2 years ago. That really goes into this deep analysis of what makes up a campaign supporter. The other thing to understand is that when we're building up ideological supporters, it isn't a sales cycle. And this is where politics kind of diverges from entrepreneurship in a little bit, because we're not selling them anything, because we are moving them through what is called a ladder of engagement. Now, a ladder of engagement is really interesting because this is what takes somebody from being unaware of a cause to being a hardcore advocate of a cause. And one of the things I'm assigned to you guys is to go up and look up Obama's ladder of engagement, because it is the process that he used to move people from being unaware of Barack Obama as a senator in Illinois to being on his campaign committee, to making donations, to volunteering, to working in state or local campaign offices. This is the process, the ladder of engagement. And a ladder of engagement works like this. First of all, somebody's unaware of something. You identify an audience. You start targeting them with messaging to make them aware of your issue. They start to become observers. They start to understand it. Maybe they do something small like your Facebook page. Once they like your Facebook page, you can have more conversations with them. You can start understanding data about the large groups of audiences and do audience segmentation with the people who like the Facebook page. So you start understanding them more. Once you do that, you can target them with more specific messaging specific to the issues and causes that they believe in, and then they become advocates. So Obama's ladder of engagement worked like this. They told people about Obama. They developed audiences that they targeted with messages about Obama to make people aware. Then they got them to like his Facebook page. Then they started targeting them with more specific messages. And then on Barack Obama's birthday, they asked for everybody to sign Barack's birthday card. Once they did that, you give the campaign your name, address, phone number, email address. Now they got you. Now they can match you against an enhanced voter file to see what kind of issues and causes you really care about. Now they can target you with messaging that really matters to get you to the point where you are ready to make donations, where you now associate the issues that you care about with Obama, and you can start advocating. You start making donations and supporting Barack Obama. Now, this is the whole process. We're not going to go too deep into this, but I just want to put this out here because if you go to the from data, initial audience, education, contact, that right there is where Libraries Transform, Geek the Library, Read Posters, that's where it ends. The rest of the work that we have to do is the whole rest of this audience engagement roadmap. And this is a long process. This is like years of work, which is why when we're working with a campaign, we always try to work with them years in advance so that they can move people through this process. If we can't move people through this process, we just can't win the campaign. In order to do it, we need to understand what's wrong with our data. And what's wrong with our data is that we don't have any. The awareness to funding study was great, but it didn't tell us who supported libraries. We don't tell us what demographic groups. We didn't tell them. It doesn't tell us enough about race, gender, socioeconomic status, or any of those other things. And it doesn't tell us enough about the messages to deliver to those people to make those demographics effective. And everything that we do starts in the data because data is what allows us to build out audiences for a campaign. And building out audiences is really important. The reason Donald Trump's campaign won, or one of the big reasons that they won, is because they had 1,200 separate and distinct audiences that they had segmented in order to get them to rally support for Donald Trump. 1,200, right? Now, in a lot of our communities, 1,200 will be like one person per audience, so it doesn't make much difference. But we need to understand that we have more audiences than we have in our library industry, because right now we segment our audiences in our community to children, teens, adults, seniors, and parents. And that's 5 audiences, but those aren't even the audiences that really drive people's decision-making process. We have to segment our audiences much further. We have to really start to understand them, because if we don't, then we can't engage them with effective messaging. Now, we can get audiences from a bunch of different places: A to Z databases, Reference USA, Facebook or social media. Social hacking is like going to a museum's donor wall and writing down everybody's name that donated. We have Orange Boy, Analytics on Demand, those kinds of things, and that can help allow us to segment our audiences down. Now, one of the best ways to build up these audiences is with polling and big data. And we need to start looking at doing really robust public opinion polling within our communities to really start understanding who supports libraries and why. We should be working with public opinion polling firms. We should be running that awareness to funding study every single year, and we should do a lot more with it. And it's going to tell us everything that people care about in our communities, and individually, what does this individual care about? What does that individual care about? What makes up their racial, gender, socioeconomic status, Republican, Democrat, all those kinds of different things. Which brings us, of course, to a discussion about privacy. Now, I'd love to really dive into a discussion of privacy, but I'm talking about people opting in. I'm talking about people freely giving their information to the campaigns. I'm not talking about Cambridge Analytica level stuff where we're stealing their data, okay? I'm talking about opting in. Now, ideological supporters all comes down to messaging, and how do you message them to build the support? The thing we need to understand, and to do this, is that we're not messaging people to convince them to change their minds. The point of messaging is to get them to attach the library to the issues that they already believe in. So if somebody believes about education, we talk to them about how libraries engage with education, solve issues within education, so that when somebody says, we have this big problem with education in our community, one of the first things they think of is the library. And that's really how messaging needs to work. We're not convincing them to change their mind about libraries. We're just attaching libraries to their already held preconceived notions, beliefs, and belief systems. Now, messaging has 5 C's. I'm going to run out of time, guys. I apologize. Messaging has 5 C's: contrasting, convincing, consistent, concise, clear. It needs to be contrasting with the opposition. If you are saying the same thing that the opposition is, then you are just the opposition. You're the exact same thing, right? It needs to be convincing. Of course, don't tell people that libraries cure cancer. They don't. Your message needs to be consistent. You're saying the same thing over and over and over again. That's how people start to believe your messaging. It needs to be concise. It needs to be clear. Small messages, small words is really, really important when building out a message. One of the big things that keeps me up at night is our use of language in this industry, because we have 78% of Americans, or 78% of librarians are progressive. We have a very progressive language in this industry. And having a very progressive language in this industry means that we talk about libraries using progressive values, using progressive language, but that doesn't resonate with conservative voters. And we live in a red state, so we need to convince conservatives to vote yes for libraries. We need to start speaking their language. And this is like, do we talk about libraries as a social welfare organization where we're bridging the digital divide, where we're helping marginalized communities, where we are providing these services to the people? Or do we talk about libraries as economic development agencies, where we talk about return on investment, where we talk about prosperity, where we talk about helping people pull themselves up by their bootstraps and getting back to work, those kinds of things. We need to really have a real clear understanding of the language that both sides use so that we can speak those languages. And there's 2 books that I'm going to recommend here. The first is called Words That Work by Frank Luntz, and the other one is called The Political Brain by George Lakoff. Frank Luntz is a Republican pollster, a Republican message builder. George Lakoff is a progressive, kind of the same thing. And so reading those 2 books, you kind of start to see how the 2 sides speak and how they speak differently. And I'm I'm running out of time, but I'm going to give you guys a couple of different things here just before I head out. I'm going to skip a couple of things, so I apologize. But one of the things that when you start thinking about is building audiences. You can create these funnels just like you see people do on Facebook, where you build an audience, you engage them, where then you can get content leads, where you can get leads, where you can then solicit them to make donations, volunteers to get supporters. And if you don't have this built in, again, then you aren't doing advocacy. If you don't have a way to engage them where you are collecting leads from your advocacy to engage them at a deeper level, you plain and simply aren't doing advocacy. And this is the big piece that we need to understand, because it's going to drive a lot of our decision-making process around our websites, which are very one-directional, right? Everything on our website goes one way. We need to get off things like WordPress, Drupal, Squarespace, et cetera, and we need to start thinking about CRMs, things like Nation Builder, Salesforce, I don't care what it is, but these are two-directional platforms that allow us to build support with these individuals by identifying leads, by engaging them, by talking to them. And a strong integrated data website has all of these kinds of things built right into it. Nation Builder does all of this stuff for you. It moves people through that ladder of engagement in a really meaningful way, and that is really, really important. I'm going to, last couple of slides here. If you aren't getting email address from every single person that walks through your door, you're missing a huge opportunity. Anywhere that you go out, you should be getting email addresses. And the power of email, look at Bernie Sanders' campaign, millions of dollars raised primarily by email. That's what drove his campaign. Email list is absolutely the key to the internet. It's the only platform that allows people to communicate across platforms. You can't communicate from Facebook to Twitter, but you can communicate from Google email to Yahoo email, right? Email is key to the internet. All right. So last couple of things real quick. For EveryLibrary, help us build up the identified supporters in this country. Like us on Facebook, and then invite your friends and family to like us on Facebook as well. We are building the nation's largest group of individuals, identified library supporters, so that we can cultivate them and get them ready to support libraries. We don't just keep the data. When we work with a campaign, providing local data sets is one of the things that we do to support local campaigns. So you doing that really helps build a national data set about library supporters in this country. Right now we're running Vote Libraries Month. Please take a moment to go to votelibraries.org, share out our materials. We are encouraging people to pledge to vote yes for libraries and for politicians who support libraries through Vote Libraries Month. Hashtag Vote Libraries, you can find it on Twitter, Instagram, everything, okay? And if you want some further learning, fundlibraries.org, you can get our bundle, Winning Elections and Influencing Politicians, and then Before the Ballot, Building Political Support for Library Funding comes out this spring. Fundlibraries.org. We'll take you to the ALA site to purchase that bundle. And then if you guys have any questions, once again, find me on Twitter, Facebook, social media as PC Sweeney. We can have discussions there. I'm sorry I went a couple of minutes over, team, but thank you for having me. I'm sorry again I couldn't be there in person. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to all of you. Thank you.
He's waiting so patiently. Hello?
Hello.
Oh, you can hear me. Okay, good. I don't, am I in the room now? Can you hear me in the room? Okay, thanks. Great. Now everybody can hear me. So this is Mary Beth again, and I just wanted to say thank you very much for that really insightful piece of information, or pieces. The other question that I had for you real quick is, if we go to your website, do you actually have a list of the local politicians that might support libraries?
We are building it, but no. the thousands of local politicians, city council members, county. It's impossible to keep our database that size.
I thought that would just be a perfect solution, but you know what? We can all do a little work too. We're librarians. We know how to do that.
Just ask. All you got to do is ask.
Ask them. All right, we all have an assignment. Thank you very much, Patrick. We appreciate your time today, and thank you for your persistence.
Thank you. Have a good day.